Hey guys, tonight we slip softly into the velvet-draped corridors of time, where chandeliers glow faintly and the scent of beeswax and roasted chestnuts lingers in the air. You're wrapped in a blanket of twilight now, gliding gently past tapestries and muffled footfalls, only to arrive at a long-forgotten dining table, one piled high with pastries, puddings, and things that probably should never have been eaten in that much quantity. And there, in the candlelight, sits a king with a spoon in his hand and regret on his face. That's right. This story begins with the famously full-bellied end of King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden. If you think gluttony is just a sin from storybooks, wait until your ribs hurt from imagining what this man ingested before he dropped dead in his palace chambers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in Stockholm. It's February 1771, and everything is icy except for the royal kitchens, where something sweet is steaming. You wander in past the cooks, whose aprons are powdered with flour, their hands sticky with jam. King Adolf Fredrik is already seated. His powdered wig is slightly askew from the excitement of what's coming. Tonight's dessert is semla, those cardamom-scented cream buns filled with almond paste, traditionally eaten just before Lent. 1 is indulgent. 2 is reckless. But 14? 14 semla, all swimming in warm milk. He was never a particularly powerful monarch, nicknamed the king who ate himself to death, which is honestly not how you want to be remembered at a coronation. His reign had been mostly symbolic, a decorative crown atop a shifting and often chaotic Swedish political scene. But tonight, he's not thinking about the Riksdag or constitutional crises. He's focused on dessert. And what a feast it was. After a full meal of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, kippers, champagne, and more, because moderation is for peasants, he polished off those 14 buns like he was being paid by the bite. One after the other. The creamy middles, the sugared tops, the milk bath soaking into every fluffy crevice. You're not sure whether to be impressed or horrified. Now, here's your scholarly twist. Historians still argue whether it was really the buns that did him in. Some suggest the heart was already failing, that he had underlying health conditions, or perhaps that the stress of ruling a politically volatile Sweden played a part. But let's be honest, chugging that much dairy during a northern European winter can't have helped. Imagine the servants, hovering nearby, trying to figure out if the royal groans were of pleasure or distress. And then, silence. A slump. A dropped spoon. The kind of hush that settles when everyone realizes something just turned very, very real. Ironically, the semla itself has outlived him, still eaten every February across Sweden with whipped cream and innocent joy, while King Adolf remains a cautionary tale whispered between bites. You can picture him now, his royal portrait staring blandly at you from a dusty museum wall, while tourists murmur, "Isn't he the one who?" Yes. Yes, he is. There's a subtle sadness here, too. In a time when monarchs died in battle or from plots and poison, to be taken out by dessert feels both ridiculous and oddly human. It's like when someone famous slips on a banana peel, it reminds you that status can't protect against stupidity or indigestion. As you float slowly away from the dinner table, you hear the clink of silverware and the whisper of gossip among the palace staff. No dramatic sword fights, no whispered betrayals, just too much food, a weak heart, and maybe, just maybe, a royal who was a little too fond of cream. And as you ease deeper into this sleepy tale, you might feel your own belly shift slightly, remembering that one time you overdid it at the buffet. You survived. Adolf Fredrik? Not so much. You'll find no grand mausoleum to honor him, no sweeping epic. Just crumbs, cream, and a history book footnote that makes people chuckle through their yawn. You don't smell fire at first. It's more of a sharp, sour tang, something acrid curling in from behind the velvet curtains. The night is quiet, almost smug in its stillness, but beneath that hush, something is smoldering. Now you're in Navarre. Mid-14th century. The castle stones are warm from an unusually dry summer, and the royal physicians are, let's put it kindly, experimenting. King Charles II of Navarre, a man whose nickname was Charles the Bad, isn't exactly beloved. He's clever, conniving, and possibly just unlucky. He survived plots, revolts, and more than one attempted poisoning. But tonight, it's not politics that gets him, it's linen. And brandy. And fire. You hover at the edge of his sick room. It's dim and smoky, the windows shuttered against a chill that never really arrived. Charles lies on a thin mattress, shivering from what might be a fever or simply from the creeping knowledge that his enemies are more patient than he is. The royal doctor, who's likely never read a medical text that didn't involve leeches, has concocted a rather bold treatment. You watch as strips of linen are soaked in brandy and wrapped around the king's frail limbs. Brandy, linen, a room full of candles. You already know how this ends. Historians still argue whether it was an accident or a bit of royal sabotage. One version of the story claims a careless servant brought the flame too close and whoosh, Charles becomes a human torch. Another blames static from the wool blankets. Either way, it's one of history's most unintentionally flamboyant deaths. He doesn't go quietly, of course. There's screaming and flailing, and the sound of rushed footsteps that arrive just a little too late. Imagine trying to douse a king without offending him, or inhaling too much smoke and missing your own opportunity for promotion. And the irony? Charles the Bad had survived so many assassination attempts that it almost felt like he was invincible. Poisoned wine, angry nobles, dangerous alliances, he'd always slipped through. But the thing that finally did him in was something out of a kitchen accident. You glance at the court advisors, their eyes wide, already spinning this into a tale of bravery or martyrdom, maybe even divine punishment. After all, this is the Middle Ages. Death needs a narrative, and preferably one with a moral. He burned with ambition, they'll say, not he combusted due to a poor understanding of flammable liquids. Now here's the quirky twist. In some versions of the tale, the servant simply lit the bandage to seal it, as was common at the time, but forgot to put it out. Others suggest it was a deathbed punishment, a final revenge from someone who'd lost a father, brother, or title at Charles's hands. Because Charles wasn't just the bad, he was legitimately, record confirmed, a nightmare to work with. You step back as the smoke clears. His body is barely identifiable. The fire didn't just end his reign, it erased him, almost literally, from the room. No glorious final words. Just a cautionary tale that would eventually smolder through European courts, whispered behind lace fans and raised goblets. Don't pull a Charles. And what did the kingdom do after? Mourning, naturally. But you get the sense they were also relieved. His death cleared the path for new alliances, less scheming, and fewer flammable medical emergencies. Still, there's something strange about watching a monarch consumed by something so domestic. Not war, not scandal, not rebellion. Just a bad treatment plan and some highly flammable ambition. You drift back into the hall, the scent of scorched silk still following you. In a world where kings could die by the sword, poison, or palace intrigue, Charles II of Navarre managed to die in a way that would make a modern fire marshal scream into a clipboard. And yet, somehow it suits him. You're not expecting the sound of laughter. Not here, not now, and certainly not from someone as royal and rumbling as King Martin of Aragon. But there it is, a high, wheezing cackle coming from his bedchamber, echoing down the marble halls like a particularly unruly parrot. The year is 1410. You're in the kingdom of Aragon, somewhere near the coast where the night air smells like orange blossoms and faint sea salt. The palace is quieter than usual, tensions rising, courtiers pacing, wondering if this will be Martin's final night. He's been sick, yes, and his dinner was a questionable plate of eels, but the man has survived worse. Or so they hope. You slip into his chamber just in time to see the royal physician leaning awkwardly against a carved bedpost. His robes are stained, his face pale, and he's trying his best not to look like this is the most baffling medical case he's ever seen. Martin, however, is in fits. The king can't stop laughing, and no one can figure out why. Now here's where things get deliciously strange. Earlier that evening, Martin had asked his court jester where he'd been the past few days. The jester, dry as old parchment, replied, in a vineyard, hunting hares. Which is not, you'll notice, where hares typically live. The absurdity hit Martin just right, and he began laughing, and laughing, and laughing. This is, according to the most popular account, how he died, laughing himself straight into the afterlife. Though historians still argue whether it was truly the joke or the indigestion from that eel-heavy supper that triggered the collapse. Maybe both. Maybe the timing was just that unfortunate. You watch as his body convulses, not with mirth now, but something closer to spasms. His laughter turns sharp, jagged. Then he freezes. The bed creaks as he slumps sideways, mouth still parted in a ghost of a grin. You'd think dying from laughter might be a pleasant way to go. But in this case, it's eerily disorienting. The laughter rings on even after his breath has stopped, echoed by confused courtiers who aren't sure if they should chuckle or panic. Here's the official version, polished and paraded for foreign dignitaries. King Martin passed away peacefully in his sleep following a short illness. Sure, an semla is just a small pastry. What they don't say is that his final moments looked like the weirdest stand-up comedy show of the 15th century. Of course, it's not the only time in history someone's reportedly died of laughter. There's the philosopher Chrysippus, who allegedly laughed himself to death after watching a donkey eat figs. Yes, really. But Martin's case? It's a rare royal example. Proof that even the most powerful aren't immune to the perils of poor digestion and good timing. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Some believe the laughter was just a symptom, a neurological response triggered by toxins from bad food, or perhaps a seizure misinterpreted by those who'd rather believe in cheerful endings. After all, it's a far more romantic headline than King dies of fishy stomachache. Still, his legacy isn't just about how he died. Martin left no heir, and with his death came a dynastic crisis known as the interregnum, 2 years of political chaos where various relatives and rivals scrambled for the throne. Laughter, it turns out, has consequences. You linger in the room a moment longer. The jester, awkwardly holding his hat in trembling hands, looks like he might burst into tears or possibly laughter again. A servant quietly removes the eel platter. Someone else draws the curtain closed, not quite sure if this counts as a tragedy or a dark farce. And you? You drift onward, still hearing echoes of that ill-timed joke, wondering what it means that someone can laugh so hard they break the boundary between here and wherever monarchs go next. Maybe the body can only handle so much joy, or maybe it was just a particularly unfunny eel. Either way, it's official. Martin of Aragon remains one of the only rulers to have giggled his way right off the throne. You feel the heat before you see anything. Thick, heavy, unnatural warmth pressing through the corridors like an unseen tide. The air is dense, humming faintly. Something is off. You're in St. Petersburg now, late 18th century, and the Russian Empire is about to lose one of its most infamous rulers in a death so tangled in myth that it's almost more legend than history. Catherine the Great. Yes, that Catherine. Empress, reformer, intellectual, lover of art, and victim of one of the most stubbornly persistent rumors in royal history. You probably already know the punchline people like to whisper at parties, the unspeakable claim about a horse. But let's slow down, because that's not only grotesque, it's also, brace yourself, not true. Historians still argue whether the original source of the rumor was political slander, palace gossip, or just someone with a twisted sense of humor and access to parchment. What we do know is that by the time Catherine died in 1796, her enemies had long been sharpening their insults. She'd seized the throne in a coup, corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers, and scandalized half of Europe with her romantic life. Powerful women tend to attract embellishment. So what really happened? You float through the amber-lined halls of the Winter Palace, where the furniture is stiff, the politics stiffer, and everyone walks like they're being watched. Catherine is in her private chambers when it begins, a sudden collapse, reportedly while she's seated on what they euphemistically called a close stool. Yes, a toilet. Not glamorous, but painfully human. She's discovered unconscious, slumped awkwardly, her face pale and damp. The staff, trained to keep calm under any circumstances, begin whispering prayers while sending for help. She's moved to her bed, but never regains consciousness. By the next evening, Catherine the Great is gone. The official diagnosis? A stroke, what they called an apoplexy in those days. It's quiet now. You can almost hear the clink of a dropped brooch as a lady-in-waiting stifles a sob. Or maybe it's a sigh of relief. Catherine's reign was long, complicated, and for many, deeply polarizing. Her death marked the end of an era and the start of some very creative historical reimaginings. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some claim she died in bed after trying to mount an elaborate mechanical device involving pulleys and, yes, a horse. The story has no basis in fact, but it spread with wildfire speed, whispered by diplomats, courtiers, and rival monarchs who found it easier to mock a woman than to credit her achievements. It's been called one of history's most sexist smear campaigns. Still, the myth lingers, the way unfair rumors often do. But if we look past the tall tales, we see something else. Catherine didn't die in battle or exile. She died in her home, surrounded by power and legacy. Her reforms had reshaped the Russian legal system. Her expansionist policies had extended the empire's borders. Her love of books had stocked entire libraries. And yet, some remember her mostly for the one story that never actually happened. It's strange, isn't it? How a woman who ruled for over 3 decades, survived palace coups, and corresponded with Voltaire could be remembered primarily for a bathroom accident and a barnyard lie. But you feel her presence even now, regal and frustrated, maybe a little amused. Catherine was nothing if not a realist. She knew the cost of power, the price of reputation. She once wrote, "I am one of the people who love the why of things." If she could read the gossip that followed her, she'd probably ask why anyone thought a woman who conquered the Crimea would need a horse to feel powerful. So you drift out of the palace as shadows lengthen. The snow outside glows faintly under moonlight. Behind you, Catherine lies still, majestic even in death, if not entirely dignified. You wonder how she'd rewrite her ending if she could. Probably with more Latin and fewer livestock. You're standing in a dark corridor of the Palace of Versailles, and the walls are almost too perfect. Gilded trim, polished marble, mirrors reflecting endless chandeliers. It feels like a dream constructed by someone who's never had to clean up after a party. And tonight, the French monarchy is on edge. It's 1774. King Louis XV lies in bed, sweating and delirious, while outside, the carefully manicured gardens whisper with rumors. At first, his illness had seemed routine, a fever, some exhaustion. But now, you catch the scent before you even reach the royal chamber. It's sour and sickly, clinging to the silk drapes and thickening the air with something unmistakably wrong. Smallpox, the kind that doesn't go away. You hesitate near the threshold. The bed is vast, but the king looks small inside it, like a child wrapped in too many covers. His once famous handsomeness has melted away, replaced by swelling, lesions, and a grayish pallor that even candlelight can't soften. The courtiers whisper behind gloved fingers, faces tight with panic, because this isn't just a king dying. It's a divine right unraveling before their eyes. Here's the historical fact. Louis XV contracted smallpox in May and died painfully within days. His death ended a reign that had begun with optimism and ended in scandal, corruption, and widespread public resentment. By the end, he was so unpopular that many saw his illness as divine judgment. Now, brace for the deeply awkward bit. As the disease progresses, Louis's body becomes alarming. Doctors insist on continuing their traditional treatments, bleeding, herbal poultices, whispering prayers at a rate of roughly 3 per minute. But nothing works. And the court? They try to follow etiquette, even as the king's body begins to break down in very unregal ways. This is where things get gruesomely fascinating. Quirky tidbit time. His royal mistresses, he had many, but Madame du Barry was the last official one, were hurried out of the palace under cover of night, as if smallpox could judge personal morality. And once the lesions covered his face, the king was reportedly placed behind a screen to shield his subjects from the horror of seeing their once immaculate monarch so visibly decaying. Imagine the King of France, ruler of the most opulent court in Europe, slowly dissolving behind a decorative folding screen like a character in a tragic play nobody wanted tickets to. By the time of his death, most of the palace had emptied. Nobles and clergy quietly slipped away, hoping not to catch the disease or the blame. The king's corpse was considered so contagious that instead of a grand procession, his body was quickly sealed in a lead-lined coffin and hauled off to St. Denis with as little ceremony as possible. Onlookers reportedly jeered as the funeral carriage passed. It was a royal death without the royal respect. Historians still argue whether his reign deserves the venom it received in retrospect. He presided over decades of peace, expanded the colonies, and helped modernize France's administration. But his late-in-life scandals, affairs, extravagance, and indifference to suffering painted him as the perfect symbol of aristocratic excess. His death didn't inspire mourning. It inspired bitterness. Even you, standing quietly in the velvet shadow of that final room, feel it, the strange emptiness of a monarch who outlived his welcome. And yet, his passing marked a turning point. With Louis XV gone, the teenage Louis XVI inherited the throne. You know where that story is heading. But for now, the court is busy disinfecting everything in sight and pretending they never doubted the divine right of kings, just maybe the divine sense of hygiene. A few servants scrub at the stone floors with vinegar, while a bishop fumbles his way through the last rites. The windows are flung open in vain hope of cleansing the stench, and everyone avoids eye contact. It's not the kind of death that gets painted. It's the kind that gets whispered about for generations. Outside, Versailles is strangely still. No horses, no fireworks, no music. Just the lingering fear that if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. The divine monarch, hidden behind a screen in his final moments, dies not with a roar but a rasp. You turn to leave, footsteps silent on the marble. Smallpox was impartial. Elegant or not, it didn't care for thrones or titles. And as history will soon show, neither did the people. It smells like ink and old linen. You're in Westminster Palace now, somewhere between politics and pestilence, in a building that creaks with too many secrets. It's 1327, and the torchlight throws wobbly shadows on stone walls that have seen more betrayals than celebrations. You tread quietly, because what's about to happen isn't written in royal biographies, it's whispered behind goblets and etched into prison walls. Edward II, King of England, isn't exactly everyone's favorite monarch. By this point, he's been deposed, imprisoned, and if rumors are to be believed, murdered in a manner so mortifying, it's still hard to say out loud without cringing. He was a complicated man, poorly suited for kingship, more interested in his male companions than matters of state, and woefully unprepared for war, particularly against Scotland. Yes, that's Scotland. The one with Robert the Bruce. His reign was a tangle of favoritism, rebellion, and facepalm-worthy political decisions. And eventually, people had enough. His wife, Isabella, dubbed the She-Wolf of France, and her lover Roger Mortimer took matters into their own hands. Spoiler, marital counseling was not involved. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. Edward was forcibly abdicated in favor of his young son, Edward III. He was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, a chilly stone fortress where he languished in awkward captivity. At first, reports suggest he was treated well. After all, deposed kings are still kings. But things went downhill quickly, and in 1327, he died under highly suspicious circumstances. This is where things take a turn from sad to deeply embarrassing. You've heard the story, no doubt, that Edward was murdered with a red-hot poker inserted in an area, best left unnamed. The theory? His killers wanted no visible marks, no suspicious wounds. Just a bit of internal scorching. Effective, deniable, horrifying. And yet, historians still argue whether this method was even real. Was it just a lurid invention of later chroniclers trying to paint Edward as both weak and wicked? Or was it genuinely carried out in some dark corner of the castle, under the sickly flicker of torchlight, while guards turned their backs? You pass into a low-ceilinged room with a single iron ring in the wall. The stone is damp. The kind of place where sound doesn't echo, it just disappears. It's easy to imagine Edward here, shivering, stripped of power, and slowly realizing that no one was coming to save him. The guards mutter. Somewhere, a fire crackles. And then, let's pause for your quirky tidbit. Some accounts say Edward didn't die at all, that he escaped, lived out his life as a monk in Italy, and was later spotted in disguise, because obviously, a deposed English king could just blend in with the locals and live quietly. Still, there are letters, sightings, and whispers that he might have survived. It's unlikely, but the very fact people wanted to believe it says a lot about how disturbing the official version was. Whether he was burned from the inside out or quietly suffocated in his sleep, Edward's death has haunted history because of the grotesque imagery. He became a medieval cautionary tale. Don't trust your wife, don't over-pamper your favorites, and absolutely never lose a war against Scotland. The legacy he left behind wasn't one of laws or reforms. It was one of awkward pauses in high school history classes. And worse, it opened the door for Mortimer and Isabella to seize power, though they wouldn't hold it for long. Young Edward III eventually grew up, staged his own coup, and had Mortimer executed. Isabella? She lived out her days in genteel confinement, probably wondering if all of this could have been solved with a few better diplomatic decisions and significantly less fire. You take one last look at the cell. The torch gutters. A mouse skitters past the doorway. And you can't help but think, whatever the truth was, it says something unsettling about royal power. That it can evaporate so completely, the only thing left is a rumor involving a poker and a permanent wince. The wind is sharp tonight, biting through your sleeves as you walk along the gray stone corridors of Stirling Castle. It's 1286, and the Scottish Highlands are cloaked in late winter gloom. Somewhere far off, a wolf howls, which honestly feels a little too on the nose right now. Because this one begins with a horse and ends with a royal faceplant that plunges Scotland into chaos for decades. Say hello to Alexander III, King of Scots. He's a relatively capable monarch, known for a rare kind of medieval competence. He maintained peace, expanded Scottish sovereignty, and held off English meddling longer than most. He ruled through balance of diplomacy, of warcraft, and of a surprisingly sturdy economy. You get the sense that if he'd been born in another century, he might have owned a very successful chain of artisanal meaderies. But history isn't kind to kings who get too comfortable. And Alexander's end? It's so absurdly avoidable that it almost reads like medieval slapstick. Here's your historical fact. On the night of March 18, 1286, Alexander attended a council meeting in Edinburgh. He stayed late, long enough for the evening to turn dark and stormy. Against the advice of literally everyone around him, he insisted on riding back to his wife in Kinghorn, across the Firth of Forth, in pitch-black weather. The advisors begged. The priests warned. The stable hands probably just sighed and muttered under their breath. But Alexander, 35 and full of confidence, mounted his horse anyway. And now you're following him. He gallops through the darkness, escorted by a few anxious attendants and the ghosts of good decisions past. The cliffs near Kinghorn are steep, the paths narrow, and the sea wind cruel. There's no moon, no lanterns, just the occasional flash of lightning casting warped shadows across the moor. And then, just like that, he's gone. His horse, unable to see the edge, misjudges the path. Alexander is thrown, some say head first, into a ravine. His broken body is discovered the next morning, crumpled beneath the cliff. No enemies. No battle. Just one very bad ride. Here comes the quirky bit. According to some fringe accounts, Alexander was carrying a gift of pears for his new queen. Pears. Royal fruit transport may not seem dramatic, but picture a sack of slightly squished produce lying next to a royal corpse. Not exactly the noble image his stone effigy ended up depicting. Historians still argue whether his death was just foolishness, or if darker forces were at play. Was the path sabotaged? Was his horse spooked deliberately? Did political rivals see an opportunity and quietly help fate along? No evidence ever surfaced. But conspiracy loves a vacuum, and Alexander's sudden demise created a massive one. With no surviving children and only a granddaughter, Margaret, living far away in Norway, Scotland was thrust into a succession crisis so messy it makes Game of Thrones look like a neighborhood bake-off. This little tumble would eventually lead to civil war, foreign intervention, and the rise of figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. It's hard not to look at the cliff edge and feel a pang of secondhand frustration. If he'd just waited till morning. If he'd listened. If he hadn't insisted on playing knight-errant for the sake of a romantic ride home. You imagine his attendants staring into the ravine, unsure whether to retrieve the body or simply report the news and brace for disaster. Because with Alexander gone, Scotland's stable monarchy collapsed like a badly pitched tent in Highland wind. In the chaos that followed, the English would seize control, rebellions would ignite, and Scottish identity itself would be forged under pressure. So many alternate timelines were balanced on that one slippery trail. You leave the path and climb toward the castle, the wind whistling as if it knows how everything will unravel from here. And in the stillness, you realize something almost comforting. Even the most majestic rulers can be undone by ignoring basic travel safety. You take a breath, feeling the cold sting your lungs, and walk on. There's a storm brewing, not just in the skies, but in history. And all of it, every drop of blood and fire and rebellion, began with a late-night ride and one final, fatal misstep. You're moving through a low corridor now, ducking under ancient wooden beams, the air thick with incense and powdered wick sweat. Welcome to 1700 Sweden, where royal intrigue smells faintly of tobacco, frost, and political overcompensation. At the center of it all is King Adolf Frederick, a man known less for his policies and more for the single, spectacular mistake that turned dinner into a death sentence. There's something comforting about imagining a monarch who just wants to eat in peace. Adolf wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't a warlord. He was, by most accounts, a gentle ruler, deeply fond of craftsmanship, candle-making, and food. So it's almost poetic that food would be what did him in. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Adolf Frederick died on February 12, 1771, after consuming a famously gluttonous meal. The official cause? Digestion complications, though. Frankly, that feels like an understatement. But we'll get there. For now, imagine the table. It groans under the weight of food. Roast meats, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and lashings of champagne. Not one or two plates, multiple courses. You're not just a fly on the wall. You're a horrified onlooker to the most indulgent episode of medieval My 600 Pounds life, you never asked for. And then comes the dessert. Semla. A soft, cardamom-scented bun filled with almond paste and piled high with whipped cream. Delicious, yes, but perhaps not when consumed in dozens. According to popular lore, Adolf topped off his absurd meal with 14 semla buns, served in a bowl of hot milk. That's not dessert. That's a cardiovascular ambush in a teacup. Now, for your quirky tidbit. Semla was originally a modest, pre-Lenten treat meant to signal restraint before fasting. Leave it to royalty to turn that into a dairy-soaked demolition derby. You'd think anyone, at the table might have gently suggested pacing. A cough, a sideways glance, maybe switch to tea, Your Majesty? But apparently no one interrupts a king mid-carb spiral. And as the legend goes, later that evening, Adolf Frederick collapsed with severe stomach pains and died soon after. Historians still argue whether it was truly the semla that did him in. Some believe the real cause was a stroke. Others say he suffered from chronic digestive issues that flared up after the meal. But the popular version, death by dessert, is so vivid, so absurdly human, that it's the one that stuck. You peer into the dining hall where it happened. The candelabras are low and flickering, casting buttery light on polished plates and wine-stained napkins. The scene is deceptively cozy, until you picture a monarch keeling over, surrounded by half-eaten pastries and stunned footmen trying to figure out how, exactly, to phrase this in the obituary. And the irony? Adolf's death marked a political turning point. His passing paved the way for the rise of Gustav III, one of Sweden's most notable monarchs. Without the semla situation, the entire arc of 18th-century Swedish governance might have played out differently. There's a kind of tragic comedy in it all. Kings fall in battle. They're assassinated. They vanish on crusades or fall victim to conspiracies. But Adolf? He succumbed to the culinary equivalent of a dare. You step away from the banquet table, your footsteps echoing off the parquet floor. The air still holds the ghost of cinnamon and butter. You can't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the man. He wasn't trying to rule with an iron fist or conquer empires. He just really liked buns. Somewhere, a historian tries to find a way to write this without using the phrase death by dessert. Spoiler, they fail. We all do. Because that's the version history insists on telling: sweet, tragic, and just a little bit sticky. The floor beneath your feet creaks like it's sighing under centuries of secrets. You're in a chilly stone tower now, high above the winding lanes of Prague. It's the year 1618, or more precisely, the fallout of 1618, and Europe is simmering with tension. Religious tension, political tension, and, apparently, tension about windows. Because this section? It all begins with a defenestration. Yes, really. Say hello to Wenceslas IV. Or at least, his ghost. He's not our main character tonight, but his bloodline is. Because the man we're really here for, Wenceslas's descendant and spiritual successor in drama, is Wenceslas III, the last male of the pre-Mislid dynasty and an unfortunate footnote in royal mortality. Wenceslas III had all the makings of a bold ruler: youth, ambition, and a knack for inheriting crowns like they were Pokemon cards. By 1306, he was already king of Hungary and Bohemia and had his sights set on Poland. Sounds great on paper, except he wasn't exactly beloved. He made enemies. Fast. And his reign felt more like an aggressive chess match than a stable dynasty. Now for your mainstream historical fact. Wenceslas III was assassinated in Olomouc at the tender age of 17. Stabbed to death while preparing for his campaign to claim Poland. No trial. No final words. Just a sudden, violent punctuation mark to his short reign. You walk through the narrow hall where he was reportedly staying, a dagger's shadow practically hanging in the air. It's quiet now, just your footsteps and the occasional gust from the tiny slit windows. But the echoes of betrayal are unmistakable. Now for your quirky tidbit. According to rumor, Wenceslas was lying shirtless on his bed, practicing swordplay for fun when the assassin entered. Imagine the last king of a 1,000-year dynasty, swinging his blade in front of a mirror like a teenager rehearsing moves from a fantasy novel, only to be fatally stabbed before finishing the pose. It would be tragic if it weren't also painfully relatable. Historians still argue whether it was a political rival, a scorned noble, or someone closer, perhaps even one of his own retainers, who carried out the murder. There were suspects, of course. Always are. But no one was ever caught. It was clean, fast, and terrifyingly efficient. And with his death, the pre-Mislid dynasty, the oldest ruling dynasty in Central Europe, came to an abrupt, awkward halt. No heirs. No uncles waiting in the wings. Just an empty throne and an empire left scratching its head. You peek into the small chamber where he may have drawn his last breath. The walls are simple, surprisingly bare for a king. There's no grandeur. Just stone and cold and a lingering sense of teenage arrogance cut short. Wenceslas's assassination triggered one of Bohemia's most turbulent successions. Rival dynasties jockeyed for position, foreign influence crept in, and the region slid into instability. And all because a teenage king was left alone long enough for someone to walk in with a knife and an agenda. Of course, it's worth noting that the young king was notoriously overconfident. Reports suggest he may have dismissed security protocols, assuming, naively, that his charm or title would protect him. This isn't the story of a noble martyr. It's the story of a boy king in over his head, trying to juggle crowns like circus pins and dropping all of them at once. You step back into the corridor. The lanterns are low, casting amber glows on the stone floor. You think about how often royal bloodlines hinge on timing. A locked door, a misplaced guard, a heartbeat's hesitation. Wenceslas III might have ruled half of Europe. Instead, he became the full stop at the end of a lineage. And somewhere in the gloom, you swear you hear the faint clink of a practiced sword, stopped mid-swing. You're walking now beneath the looming arches of El Escorial, the royal monastery palace that lies just northwest of Madrid, tucked into the Spanish highlands like a fortress built by someone who both feared God and had a thing for granite. The corridors are colder here, thicker somehow, as though the very walls remember the burdens placed upon them. And the burden in this section? It's gout. Terrible, unrelenting, soul-crushing gout. Because tonight, we meet King Charles II of Spain, one of history's most medically unfortunate monarchs, whose death wasn't just a personal tragedy, but the final gasp of a royal bloodline stretched too thin and tangled to survive. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. Charles II died in 1700 without an heir, ending the centuries-long Habsburg rule in Spain and sparking the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict that redrew borders and redefined monarchies for generations. But Charles himself? He was less a king than a walking symbol of royal inbreeding gone horribly, horribly wrong. He was born in 1661, the product of so many uncle-niece marriages that his family tree looked more like a wreath. His Habsburg jaw was so pronounced he could barely chew. He didn't speak until he was 4. He didn't walk until he was 8. And even then, you get the sense his body wasn't entirely convinced. By the time you find him here, in his final years, Charles is a shadow of a man. His skin sallow. His limbs twisted. He suffers from epileptic fits, chronic stomach issues, muscle wasting, and, of course, agonizing, disfiguring gout. He also believes he is cursed. Seriously. His court even arranges multiple exorcisms. Here's your quirky tidbit. One of his physicians swore that Charles's body did not contain a single drop of blood, only pus. Another swore the king's hair fell out in clumps, his urine was black as ink, and his breath smelled like rotting meat. And yet, he insisted on ruling, on making decisions, on marrying, twice, despite being so infertile that it was basically a miracle he could even hold court without disintegrating into chalk dust. Historians still argue whether Charles's condition was due to a specific set of recessive genetic disorders, perhaps Klinefelter syndrome or hydrocephalus, or whether it was just the compounded result of too many marriages within too few branches of the family tree. What's clear is that his decline wasn't just medical. It was dynastic. Spain itself was decaying alongside him. You pause beside a small prayer alcove. This is where he might have whispered to his confessor, asking if God had cursed him, begging to know why he was so unlucky in all he undertakes. It's a heavy echo, made heavier by the knowledge that Charles genuinely believed himself to be damned. And in a way, he kind of was. Because while his body wasted away, his court descended into, you said, factional chaos. Ministers schemed. Foreign powers circled like vultures. Even his own relatives weren't exactly rooting for a miraculous recovery. The king, barely able to rise from bed some mornings, became more symbol than sovereign, a fragile, trembling pawn caught between France, Austria, and the Vatican. You drift past his private chambers now, where the tapestries hang heavy and solemn. His final days were spent here, shrouded in incense and whispers, his body failing piece by piece. His death, when it came on November 1st, 1700, wasn't a grand royal affair. It was quiet, a wheezing surrender, and with it came the unraveling of an empire. Charles's will name Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir. That decision, unsurprisingly, did not go over well with other European powers, particularly the Habsburgs in Austria. You can almost hear the diplomatic pin scratching with fury, the treaty snapping in half, the subtle throat clearing that precedes a good old-fashioned continental war. Within months, the War of the Spanish Succession had begun, a sprawling, bloody mess that dragged on for over a decade and cost the lives of hundreds of thousands. All because one sickly king, incapable of producing an heir, had been allowed to linger on the throne too long. But here's what sticks with you. Charles didn't ask for this. He didn't choose to be the final, crumbling domino in a line of rulers that stretched back to Ferdinand and Isabella. He was a product, a sad, suffering conclusion to generations of strategic marriages that ignored biology in favor of bloodlines. You can't help but feel something in your chest twist, not just from pity, but from the sheer absurdity of how something as simple as a gene could undo an empire. You trace your fingers along the edge of his marble sarcophagus. He lies with the other Habsburgs now, interred in the royal crypt below El Escorial. His name is carved in Latin, his legacy etched in European history books. But the body inside, well, let's just say his physicians weren't being poetic. And yet, despite everything, despite the curse rumors, the disease, the derision, Charles II held the throne for 35 years. He signed treaties. He ruled court. He married. He tried. That's what makes it all the more bittersweet. It wasn't the war that killed the Spanish Habsburgs. It wasn't even the plague. It was a slow, inescapable decline, a soft unraveling that left behind a monarch too broken to save himself, let alone his country. You exit the chamber, your breath fogging slightly in the cool corridor. Behind you, the ghost of Charles II fades into the stone. Not with a roar, not even a whimper. Just the soft exhale of a man who probably never had a chance. You're wading through a haze of cigar smoke and sweat-soaked velvet now, deep in the heart of 19th century Mexico. Picture a tropical heat so thick it clings to your skin like syrup, and the hum of revolution bubbling just beneath the quiet. You're in the city of Querétaro, standing outside the crumbling Iturbide Theater, where whispers of war, empire, and betrayal echo louder than any applause ever did. This time, we meet Emperor Maximilian I, a European noble dropped into the middle of Mexico's post-independence chaos, like a porcelain figurine in the middle of a bar fight. His reign was brief, his death was bloody, and honestly, the whole thing reads like a bad idea from the start. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Maximilian, the younger brother of Austria's Emperor Franz Joseph, accepted the Mexican crown in 1864 after being invited, sort of, by conservative monarchists in Mexico and strongly encouraged by Napoleon III of France. The idea was that Mexico, newly independent but deeply fractured, would benefit from a European-style emperor. Spoiler alert, it did not. When you step inside Maximilian's temporary palace, more of a dressed-up army barracks, really, you're struck by how tragically earnest the man was. He brought books, grand ideals, and a deep love of botany. He tried to improve education. He even protected indigenous land rights. But here's the thing, none of that mattered, because his entire reign rested on the bayonets of the French army, and when those bayonets left in 1866, well, you do the math. Here's your quirky tidbit. Maximilian kept a full European court, complete with etiquette guides and ballroom dances, in the middle of a war-torn country. Imagine throwing waltzes in a jungle while guerrilla fighters planned your downfall 2 miles away. It's delusion, yes, but delusion with lace cuffs. Historians still argue whether Maximilian was a tragic idealist or an arrogant outsider. Was he duped by European powers who never intended to protect him? Or did he truly believe he could transform Mexico into a stable empire? Either way, it didn't end well. In 1867, he was captured by Republican forces under Benito Juarez. The trial was swift. The verdict? Death by firing squad. You follow the path up to the Cerro de las Campanas, the Hill of the Bells, where the execution took place. The morning sun hasn't burned through the fog yet, and for a moment, you hear the rustle of uniforms, the quiet murmurs of a foreign prince trying to maintain dignity. Maximilian's last words were reportedly calm. He asked that the soldiers aim for his heart, not his face. He gave each of his executioners a gold coin, and as the rifles fired, he fell back with the grace of a man who knew he'd become legend, or at least a cautionary tale. You glance at the small chapel that now stands on the site. Quiet. Almost too quiet. The bells don't ring anymore, but the memory of that final moment, European opera clashing with Mexican Revolution, lingers in the stillness like smoke. And here's the twist: Maximilian's death became more than a failed monarchy. It became a symbol. In Europe, it was a scandal. In Mexico, a statement. The age of imperial puppetry was crumbling. Juarez's republic took hold, shaky but determined. And the message was clear: no more crowns from overseas. You step away from the hilltop, the dust clinging to your shoes. You picture the emperor's finely tailored boots in that same dirt, the absurd contrast of imported elegance against the harshness of reality. The empire he ruled is long gone. But the story, the wild, operatic, palm-sweat-inducing story remains. Maximilian wasn't a villain. He wasn't even a conqueror. He was a man who said yes to the wrong job offer and died trying to make it work. Which, if you think about it, might be the most relatable royal mistake of all. You shuffle now through the echoing corridors of Kensington Palace, where the scent of wax polish lingers in the air and everything feels just a bit too curated. Behind each red velvet rope lies a tableau of British decorum, formal, precise, and polished to within an inch of its life. But tonight, you're here for someone who didn't get the polished ending. Far from it. This is the story of King George II, and how he died in what might be the single most embarrassing, undignified royal moment in British history: on the toilet. Yes, the literal throne. Let's get your mainstream historical fact on the record first. George II ruled Great Britain and Ireland from 1727 until his death in 1760. He was the last British monarch born outside of Britain and the last to lead troops in battle at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. So he wasn't exactly a slouch in his early years. But by the end, well, things got weird. George was a famously fussy man. He hated long meetings, didn't trust his own son, and had a lifelong obsession with punctuality. His routine was so rigid, you could set your pocket watch by it. Breakfast at 7. Cabinet meetings at 10. And how to say this delicately, bowel movements somewhere around 6 a.m. Now for your quirky tidbit. It was during one of these precisely scheduled morning visits to his closet stool, yes, that's what they called the royal toilet, when it all went downhill. Or, more accurately, down and out. Historians still argue whether it was an aortic aneurysm or a sudden heart attack, but either way, George II collapsed on the commode and hit the floor with such force that the palace staff thought a bookshelf had fallen. When the royal doctor examined the body, he noted that the king's heart had burst, as if struck by lightning. You pause near the preserved chamber display, where a discreet partition conceals a very old, very ornate wooden chair. It's not labeled, but you know. Oh, you know. This is where the king met his end, trousers around his ankles and wig slightly askew. There's something almost poetic about it. Not the noble death in battle he might have imagined. No sweeping deathbed monologues. Just a loud thud, some shattered dignity, and an entire royal court pretending very hard not to notice. And yet, despite this deeply awkward exit, George II left behind a relatively stable kingdom. He helped cement the power of Parliament, reduced royal meddling in politics, and saw the growth of the British Empire overseas. So while his death may seem laughable, his legacy, annoyingly for comedy's sake, was actually kind of respectable. You glance at the portraits lining the hallway, most of which show George in dramatic armor or swathed in ermine. Not one includes a chamber pot. Funny how that works. But don't think the British forgot. In fact, this royal passing became the stuff of whispered legend. Poets mocked it in verse. Satirists couldn't resist. Even his successors were privately amused, though not enough to publicly acknowledge that their ancestor had exited the world in the same room most people read newspapers in. You lean against the cool stone of a window ledge. Out on the lawn, everything is perfectly manicured, orderly, controlled. But inside this grand palace, a king once died mid-squat, and no amount of polished mahogany can make you forget that. It's easy to idolize royalty. Easy to forget that under the crowns and scepters, they're just human. Humans with aging hearts, overcooked breakfasts, and morning routines. And sometimes, history doesn't wait for your final speech. Sometimes, it kicks in the door at 6 a.m. and says, that's enough now. So next time someone mentions the grandeur of monarchy, you might remember George II, not for his reign, but for his very, very human finale. You're in a warm, golden haze now, wandering the sun-baked courtyards of Alexandria. No, not the ancient Egyptian marvel, but a grand villa tucked within the balmy Mediterranean sprawl of early 20th century Egypt. Marble floors, palm shadows, and the faint scent of tobacco drifting on the breeze. You'd think this was the setting for a romantic escape, but no, tonight's royal subject met his end face down on the floor of a brothel. Yes, we're talking about King Farouk I of Egypt, who may not have died in the most tragic of circumstances, but certainly one of the most embarrassing. A man who lived large, spent wildly, and exited history in a way that makes George II's toilet trip feel almost tasteful. But first, your mainstream historical fact. Farouk was Egypt's 10th and penultimate monarch under the Muhammad Ali dynasty. He came to the throne in 1936, just 17 years old, inheriting a fragile kingdom caught between fading British influence and a growing nationalist surge. Initially, he was popular, young, handsome-ish, a symbol of modernity. But give a teenager a kingdom, a palace full of suites, and a yacht the size of a football field, and what do you expect? Here's your quirky tidbit. Farouk had one of the largest collections of pornography in the Middle East. Also, he was obsessed with red telephones and is said to have once stolen Winston Churchill's pocket watch just to say he had it. His life was an all-you-can-eat buffet of vice, literally and figuratively. He gorged on lobster and caviar. He ballooned in size. He exiled political enemies like it was a sport. And according to legend, he once demanded that his chefs prepare him an entire roast camel, stuffed with lamb, which was stuffed with chickens, which were stuffed with pigeons, which were stuffed with eggs. Historians still argue whether Farouk was a victim of British meddling, a corrupt child king doomed by circumstance, or just a glutton with no impulse control. Either way, his fall came fast. By 1952, Egypt had had enough. A military coup led by General Mohammed Naguib and a certain young officer named Gamal Abdel Nasser gave Farouk 24 hours to pack. He boarded his luxury yacht with 17 suitcases, several mistresses, and a full-time pastry chef. His reign was over. And so, Farouk spent his exile in Europe, mostly Italy, haunting casinos and five-star hotels, still pretending he mattered. But the world had moved on, and so had Egypt. Now, let's get to the exit scene. In 1965, at a swanky Roman restaurant, Farouk, by then so overweight he needed custom-made furniture, reportedly devoured a meal of oysters, lamb cutlets, and cake. After finishing his final espresso, he stood up, clutched his chest, and collapsed. Some versions claim it happened on the restaurant floor. Others, more colorfully, insist it was inside a brothel shortly afterward. Either way, he was gone before help arrived. Dead at 45. A king reduced to a footnote in a news column about a coronary and a dessert tray. You lean against a sun-warmed pillar and imagine it. The great-grandson of Muhammad Ali Pasha, once ruler of Egypt and Sudan, sprawled on a tile floor in Rome, a half-eaten eclair nearby. No royal procession. No national mourning. Just a few waiters, probably very confused, calling for an ambulance. His body was shipped back to Egypt, buried quietly. No monuments. No speeches, just silence. And yet, there's something almost cinematic about it. Farouk lived as if consequence didn't exist, and when it finally caught up to him, it didn't roar. It whispered. A heart attack. A stumble. A soft thud among the clink of dessert forks. You walk through the imagined villa, past velvet chairs and gold ashtrays, wondering how someone so surrounded by luxury could be so hollowed out by the end. Maybe that's the point. Maybe royalty, when stripped of power, becomes a sort of tragic parody, less a crown, more a costume. So remember, kings may reign, but gravity doesn't care. And neither does heart disease. You drift now through the damp corridors of a crumbling Scottish castle, where every torchlit stone seems to whisper betrayal. The air is heavier here, mossy, cold, and soaked in the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. This is not a place for grand parades or royal receptions. It's a prison. And in one particular tower, behind iron-banded oak doors, a queen sits waiting to die. Tonight, you stand beside Mary, Queen of Scots, a monarch whose entire life was an opera of politics, romance, and religious war, all ending with one of the most infamous and botched royal executions in history. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. Mary Stuart was Queen of Scotland from infancy, Queen Consort of France briefly, and a claimant to the English throne. Her bloodline threatened Elizabeth I. Her Catholic faith made her a figurehead for rebellion. Her marriages, particularly to Lord Darnley and then to the infamous Earl of Bothwell, drove scandal after scandal. In short, Mary was a walking political powder keg. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Mary's personal motto was, "And my end is my beginning." And that's, well, kind of metal. It's also etched on the walls of her final chambers like a cryptic warning, or a challenge to history itself. Historians still argue whether Mary was truly a victim of political paranoia or a dangerous schemer in her own right. Was she framed for Darnley's murder? Did she truly conspire to kill Elizabeth and seize the English throne? The evidence is murky. The letters are debated. But in 1586, after the uncovering of the Babington plot, a Catholic conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne, the gears of justice, or vengeance, began to turn. And so, after nearly 2 decades of being Elizabeth's prisoner, Mary was sentenced to die. You find yourself standing in the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, now just a memory of stone and silence. On the morning of February 8, 1587, Mary was led to the scaffold in front of an audience of nobles. She wore a black cloak over a crimson petticoat, a symbolic color for Catholic martyrdom, dramatic to the very end. She spoke calmly, forgave her executioners, and knelt on the block. Now, brace yourself. The executioner raised his axe and missed. The first blow struck the back of her head. She didn't die instantly. The second blow was better, but still not clean. It took a third strike to finish the job. And then, as if the scene weren't grim enough, the executioner lifted her severed head by the hair and cried out, "God save the Queen," only for her wig to come off in his hand. The head fell, rolling across the scaffold, revealing short, gray hair beneath. Gasps filled the hall. This wasn't just a death. It was a performance, one with flubbed lines and a grisly twist ending. But wait, it gets worse. As her body was being removed, something stirred under her skirts. Her little dog, who had been hiding in her petticoats, ran out, covered in blood. The nobles, hardened political operators that they were, reportedly wept. Even the executioner is said to have turned pale. You pause in that empty hall, now windswept and overgrown. There's no stage here anymore. No red fabric. Just an echo of footsteps on timber long since rotted. But the drama of it all still clings to the stone. Mary's death became a rallying cry for Catholic Europe. In England, it deepened the paranoia. Elizabeth herself never quite recovered from signing the death warrant. She claimed later that it had been sent without her permission, and she wept when told the deed was done. Historians still debate whether this was guilt, strategy, or simply performance. But one thing is clear: Mary died as she lived, embroiled in spectacle, shadowed by plots, and entirely unignorable. And as you leave Fotheringhay in your mind, passing beneath gray skies and over frost-hardened fields, you realize something else. Mary wasn't just a queen. She was a symbol, a cautionary tale. A woman whose name still stirs arguments in lecture halls and whispers in empty castle halls. There's no elegant way to die on a scaffold. But somehow, Mary turned it into the finale of a lifelong drama and left history scrambling to make sense of the script. Now you slip into quieter territory, less bloodstained throne room, more candlelit manor house. The mood changes, grows more hushed. It's early spring in Austria, 1857, and the distant Alps cast long shadows over the Habsburg Empire. There are no coups in progress here, no guillotines, no battle cries. But don't get too cozy, because this is the story of Archduchess Mathilde, and her demise is somehow both painfully mundane and profoundly ridiculous. You pad gently across a parquet floor, past portraits of stiff-backed royals wearing uniforms 2 sizes too tight. And in the middle of it all is Mathilde, young, pretty, and destined to marry the future king of Italy. That is, until a single, tragically timed cigarette turned her into the cautionary tale of every fire safety poster you've ever seen. But let's begin with your mainstream historical fact. Archduchess Mathilde was the daughter of Archduke Albrecht, Duke of Teschen, one of the most powerful Habsburg commanders in the Austro-Hungarian military. She moved through life on a cushion of privilege, as most Habsburgs did: balls, operas, dresses with corsets tight enough to cause minor organ displacement. And yet, she was also known to be a bit of a rebel by court standards. Which brings us to the fringe fact you've been waiting for. Mathilde smoked. Now, smoking wasn't unheard of among 19th century aristocrats, but for a teenage royal girl in a Catholic court? Scandalous. Forbidden. And that only made it more delicious. On May 22, 1867, 18-year-old Mathilde was getting dressed for the theater at her family's castle in Schloss Hetzendorf, near Vienna. Like any teenager sneaking a vice, she lit a cigarette in secret while a lady-in-waiting fetched her gown. But then, someone entered the room unexpectedly, possibly her father. In a panic, Mathilde attempted to hide the cigarette in the folds of her dress. A dress, mind you, that was made of gauze. Gauze soaked in flammable oils. Gauze with the fire resistance of dry hay. You already know what happened next. Historians still argue whether it was instant or whether she screamed, but within moments, Mathilde's gown caught fire. The blaze spread so rapidly that servants struggled to douse the flames. She was burned badly, fatally, and died hours later in agony. There was no political plot, no assassination, no war. Just a cigarette, a flammable dress, and a decision made in a split second of panic. One moment, she was Austria's teenage darling, preparing for an imperial marriage. The next, a black-clad court in mourning and a royal family shattered by grief. You linger in the room where it happened, or imagine it, the polished mirror, the abandoned slipper, the faint smell of smoke that never truly fades. There's a tragic irony here, of course. The Habsburgs, so obsessed with image, protocol, control, couldn't prevent something as banal as a teenage girl setting herself on fire. And yet, this moment was quietly seismic. Her death prompted whispered changes to court customs. Dress fabrics became slightly less flammable. Young royals were more closely watched. And in the endless family trees of European aristocracy, a line simply stopped short. There's something almost unbearable about deaths like Mathilde's, not because they were unjust or cruel in grand historical terms, but because they were so stupid, so accidental, so human. And maybe that's the thread running through all the tales you've drifted through tonight, how power and prestige offer no immunity from the randomness of fate. A king on a toilet, a queen beheaded, a teenage girl with a secret cigarette. All those palaces, crowns, and scepters, none of them matter in the end. What matters is the person beneath, the moment, the misstep. So you walk now toward a window, where the moonlight falls soft on the castle grounds, and you breathe out slowly. The story is nearly over. Let's soften the light a little more, slow the pacing, and glide into the wind down. Wind down, 300 words, and now the air grows gentler. The stories settle, like dust across an empty ballroom after the last guests have gone. No more laughter, no more scandal, just the quiet echo of lives lived too brightly, too strangely, or too briefly. You ease back into yourself, letting the images melt, silken gowns trailing behind queens, distant cannon fire echoing through marble halls, footsteps down endless corridors lined with tapestries that remember more than the show. The sounds are fading now, muffled, half-remembered. Only the hush remains. It's strange to think that behind all those royal portraits, stern eyes, stiff collars, there were clumsy hands, beating hearts, fleeting moments of silliness or fear. And in the end, whether on a battlefield, in a boudoir, or just in a smoky room with a hidden cigarette, they went like anyone else. There's a kind of comfort in that, isn't there? You are not so different from them. You worry, you fumble, you laugh when you shouldn't. And when the world feels too large or absurd, remember that even kings slipped on banana peels of history. Even queens whispered regrets in the dark. So rest now. The crowns have been set aside. The swords return to their mounts. And all the embarrassing exits have had their turn under the candlelight. Breathe in. Let your shoulders drop. Let the last whispers of scandal and silk fade into velvet darkness. You are safe. You are still. And everything ridiculous can wait until morning. End of script. Sweet dreams.